Have you ever known someone who just seems to glide through life? Charming, maybe, but totally irresponsible. Maybe borrows constantly, never really holds down a job. Well, if that sounds familiar, then our deep dive today might shed some light. We're going back, way back to 1934 to look at this really fascinating psychological case study. It argues that this kind of chronic social parasitism or sycophancy, it isn't just a moral issue. No, they saw it as a serious psychological problem, something rooted deep in, like arrested development. So we're going to use this old psychoanalytic source to unpack what they call the sycophant personality. Our mission here is to try and understand the unconscious forces these early researchers thought were driving it all. It's kind of a shortcut to understanding why some traits are just so hard to change.
Yeah, and this kind of analysis really came into play because, well, nothing else was working. You had these adults, intellectually sharp, but just completely lacking any sense of responsibility, financial or social. People tried everything: moral lectures, family interventions, even putting them in institutions sometimes. None of it really stuck. The old view is pretty bleak, like nothing could be done. But these analysts thought, hang on, maybe we're missing something deeper. These unconscious drives that got set way back in their emotional development, long before they were supposed to be acting like grown-ups.
Okay, so let's get concrete. Let's meet the person at the heart of this study. They call him Dick. And apparently, he's the perfect example of this social parasite type. So, on the surface, what was Dick like? The study paints this picture of, like, total polish. Quiet confidence, sharp features, immaculate clothes. They literally said he looked like the man in the collar advertisements. Walked with grace, and he really knew how to project wealth and status. His room, filled with expensive stuff. 3 big trunks of clothes, a huge fur rug, fancy furniture, the latest radio Vitrola back then, silver stuff, fine stationery. Other guys looked up to him, envied him, saw him as this sort of ideal leader, A prince, they call him.
Exactly. But what's so interesting and kind of key here is how quickly that influence just evaporated. It was all surface. He was a master of sounding like he was about to do something big. Like, he'd agree enthusiastically, oh yeah, let's paint that building. He'd ask about scaffolding, block and tackle, sound totally invested. Nothing. Weeks later, the whole idea just vanished. Poof. Like it never happened. Drifted heedlessly into oblivion, as the source puts it.
And tied into that in action, he had this specific way of dealing with people who were actually doing things, right?
Oh yeah, mockery. He used this sarcastic, sort of sneering wit. The goal was to make genuine effort look like, quote, naive stupidity.
Like the example they gave of him seeing a guy sawing wood.
Exactly. He'd scoff and say something cutting like, well, a great big strong man. I'll bet the doctor will be pleased. Just dripping with sarcasm.
Wow, so he shames people for trying, which kind of justifies his own choice to do nothing.
It's a defense, right? A way to avoid being called out. And when people did confront him about not following through, his first reaction was usually anger. A quick flash of it, like, how dare you? I resent that.
But that didn't last.
No, it was temporary. Later, he'd slip them a secret note. Very dramatic, full of gentlemanly spirit, promising he'd definitely help next time. It's described as this sly way of just avoiding the issue head-on. He creates the impression of future action, like leaving construction gear by the road.
But it just sits there and rusts.
Precisely. It never gets used.
So any leadership he showed was actually pretty destructive.
Entirely. He was the clever, dapper leader, like a gang leader plotting petty raids. He'd be the one justifying breaking rules, setting up poker games, complaining loudly about the food being gristle. He'd even incite others to do things, like the icebox raid they mentioned. He'd plan it, get everyone else fired up.
But he wouldn't actually do the risky part himself.
Never. He was the mastermind, the manipulator, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, always protected, never getting his own hands dirty.
And that need for protection seems to carry over into his finances, too.
Oh, absolutely. Even with a decent allowance, he lived way beyond his means, always borrowing, always sinking into debt. And he wasn't above using sly tricks, like getting a lawyer to spin some yarn to his creditors about a fake trust fund coming his way, or just writing bad checks for instant gratification.
Knowing someone else would clean up the mess.
Exactly. He fundamentally understood the dynamic. He knew, deep down, he wouldn't really be allowed to suffer the consequences. He completely relied on his father to step in and bail him out every time. Steady work, forget it. He couldn't stand it. He preferred, like, superficial activity, rearranging his fancy clothes, writing these elaborate notes or telegrams to get approval.
Right, the source asks, is this just another attempt to secure approval without effort?
It seems likely.
Okay, so that phrase, approval without effort, that feels like the bridge to the psychological explanation. How did these 1930s psychoanalysts connect writing bad checks and, folding clothes to his deep inner life?
Well, the core idea they proposed was what they called oral character formation.
Oral, like mouth.
Yeah, exactly. In psychoanalytic terms, it means he's psychologically stuck, fixated at the very earliest stage of development, infancy, where the mouth, feeding, getting comfort, that's the absolute center of the universe.
Wait, so you're saying he's basically still operating like an infant, trying to, consume things for comfort?
Yeah.
Is that why he needed all the stuff, the rugs, the clothes, like they were high-status security blankets instead of things he'd actually earned?
That's a great way to put it. He sees possessions not as signs of achievement, but as protections and supports. His whole emotional logic is built around getting something for nothing.
Because that's the infant's reality, isn't it? You cry, you get fed.
Yeah.
Effortless reward.
Precisely. And this ties into those core psychological principles. His overwhelming need for immediate pleasure going into debt for fun today shows he's rigidly stuck on the pleasure principle. The infant's basic drive, I want it now. He hasn't really progressed to the reality principle.
Which says you have to work, maybe put off gratification sometimes?
Exactly. You have to deal with frustration and delay. But Dick's outlook, his sort of constant optimism that things will just work out, hope springs eternal, they saw that as mirroring the nursling who relies on the all-giving mother. He just expects the world to provide.
And you can see that reflected in other parts of his personality, too, like this lack of assertiveness.
Mm-hmm. The theory is his ego is weak because it's so dependent on identifying with that all-giving mother figure for security. This accounts for what they observed as his softness and lack of forceful aggressiveness. They even suggest a kind of femininity stemming from clinging so tightly to that maternal protection rather than developing his own independent strength.
And this affects his relationships.
Big time. He actively avoids any relationship that demands something from him where he might have to, quote, give any part of myself. Instead, he seeks out women who are understanding, non-demanding, often married women.
Because they're less likely to need him for security or commitment. They're safe mother substitutes.
That's the interpretation, yes. They provide comfort without requiring him to step up and be a provider or an equal partner.
Okay, so the deep unconscious stuff is tied to the mother, the infant experience. But consciously, his big emotional focus was on his father, wasn't it?
That's right. The conscious struggle, the day-to-day tension, was definitely with the father. Remember how Dick used to actually pretend to be his father sometimes? Represent himself as him to get access to comforts and luxuries?
Yeah, I remember that.
Well, the resentment, the deep anger, they traced it back to the father being the first person who really challenged this infantile setup. The father was the one who said, no, you have to work for things. He imposed the reality principle.
Okay. So in Dick's internal world, the father becomes the bad mother, the one who stops the endless supply, who forces weaning, who introduces limits and frustration.
That's exactly the framework. The father represents the disappointment, the restriction of his desire for effortless gratification.
And this resentment fuels the bad behavior.
The study argues, yes, all the irresponsibility, the financial messes, the slide tricks, they're not just passive failures. They are seen as active, albeit unconscious, ways to express hostility, to discharge sadistic feelings against the father.
So making his father constantly bail him out, clean up his expensive messes. That's the punishment.
It's interpreted that way, yes.
Right.
A way to make the father pay for not being the endlessly providing figure. And this cycle generates immense unconscious guilt. The source even mentions he had violent fantasies about his parents, which would feed into that guilt. So you get this really complex internal structure.
How so?
He develops a very harsh superego, an internal critic, telling him he's no good. But his ego, remember, is weak. So it protects itself. It retreats into this almost magical belief, don't worry, I'll always get out of trouble somehow.
So he hears the criticism, maybe even looks meek when being scolded.
Right. He receives it passively, but he doesn't actually internalize the principle behind it. It doesn't change his core belief that things will just work out for him without real effort.
This dynamic, this sort of failure to develop independence and assertiveness, it also showed up in his sexuality, according to the study.
Yes. They noted what they termed a strong, passive, subject-homoerotic tendency.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It's just his erotic focus was less on actively pursuing an object of desire and more inwardly focused on being desirable, particularly to male figures. They linked this back to the unresolved relationship with the father, the inverted Oedipus complex, wanting to be loved and admired by the father figure rather than competing with him. It's another form of seeking comfort and security passively without having to actively strive or achieve.
Right. So knowing all this, understanding these deep roots,
hmm
it explains why the usual fixes don't work, doesn't it? Why just punishing him or cutting off his funds is likely to fail.
Absolutely, because those actions don't address the fundamental underlying need, that deep oral narcissistic craving for security and effortless gratification. Punishment just puts up a bigger wall. The study actually warns that pushing too hard externally without addressing the internal issue could make things worse. It might lead to a deeper regression, maybe into something like alcoholism, dipsomania, as they called it, or even paranoia. You're just bottling up the pressure.
So what did offer some hope?
Psychoanalysis, according to this source. The idea was that the analytic process could offer a space for his ego to strengthen. By bringing these repressed needs and conflicts into consciousness, he could start to face them, to re-experience reality, but this time with the support of the analyst. It's about learning reality isn't just about frustration, it's also about mastery.
And did it work for Dick?
Well, they report what they call provisional success. After the analysis stopped, the follow-up showed that, for the first time ever, Dick actually held down a job continuously. And he managed to repay several $100s of debt over 2 years.
That's actually pretty significant given his history.
It is. The therapeutic goal basically was to try and shift that internal self-focused narcissistic energy, the constant need for comfort and admiration outwards, towards engaging with reality, towards actual achievement, to convert the passive subject-homoerotic focus into something more engaged with the external world and object-homoerotic orientation, or ideally towards heterosexuality, in their view back then. So based on this case, they saw analysis as the most promising path for dealing with this kind of deep-seated sycophancy.
Okay, let's pull back a bit. What's the big takeaway here for us today, thinking about this nearly century-old study?
I think the main point is that sycophancy, viewed through this lens, isn't just a personality quirk or laziness. It's presented as a fundamental personality structure, a kind of libido arrest, as they put it, stuck way back in that earliest oral phase. The result is someone who, deep down, has very little motivation to actually master the external world because their core psychological wiring is still based on expecting reward without effort.
What really strikes me is just how difficult it highlights changing these deep patterns. Dick's story shows that a personality built on this foundation of, like, magic omnipotence, this belief that things will just happen for you, is incredibly resistant to surface-level fixes. It really makes you think. Those weaknesses we see on the surface, the laziness, the manipulation, the dodging responsibility, they might actually be complex defenses rooted way down in the unconscious, much deeper than just needing a good talking to or some discipline.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought for you to chew on based on this 1934 perspective. Perhaps some of the traits we casually dismiss today as simple moral failings or just chronic laziness are actually intricate psychological defenses. Defenses designed unconsciously to protect a fragile, infantile sense of entitlement and absolute security, that feeling that the world owes you, effort optional.